Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Finding Transformation Opportunities with Generative AI. This is the second in our fall series on Gen AI, led by MIT Sloan's George Westerman and sponsored by Skillsoft. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor-in-Chief at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating the event. In the first session of this series, we laid the groundwork for what generative AI is and isn't, how it relates to current and past technologies, including other flavors of artificial intelligence, and what it takes to make good decisions about its use. If you missed that one, you can still watch it on demand from our website. We'll put a link to that in the chat. Today, we'll explore how companies develop their vision, prioritize use cases for investment, manage risk, and measure value. Our speakers today are well qualified to speak to these issues. George Westerman is a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's a pioneering researcher on digital transformation and author of the landmark book, Leading Digital. Noémie Ellezam is Chief Digital Strategy Officer at Société Générale. She drives digital transformation of the business model, as well as innovation strategy for the multinational financial services company. Welcome, George and Noémie.
Hello, Abby. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Abby, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for coming to this event. I'm really looking forward to talking with Noémie about this, and hopefully we can all learn something in the process. So, this is the second in a three-part series. We talked about what generative AI is. Now we want to talk about how do you make this work in organizations. And so we're going to concentrate especially on financial services. And why financial services? It's a big, complex industry. Innovation is difficult, not only because you have many products that you're offering, but also because the regulators in every different region in every country have different viewpoints on things, and everything is changing constantly. So when we think about something moving as quickly and as excitingly as generative AI, couldn't think of a better context than financial services to do it. This is just from a few days ago, just pulling up a bunch of headlines that talk about generative AI and financial services. And this is about a tenth of what I found in just searching around the web, right? This is something that many people are interested in. And we had to figure out how to move from talking about it to actually doing something interesting. And that's what's so exciting about Noémie being here, because you are doing something interesting. You're making this work in your company. So if I could turn it over to you to talk about what Société Générale is about.
Of course, thank you, George. Very happy to be with you and very happy to be with the audience. So Société Générale is a top-tier European bank, a universal actually bank providing all kinds of financial services. We have more than 150 years of existence, indeed, around 25 million clients, which can be B2C client, B2B client, but also B2B2C clients. We operate in more than 65 countries, and we have a bit less than 120,000 people working within the group. We operate on three main strategic pillars. The first one is all over retail banking and insurance services, including private banking, with a strong presence in France, and notably with our full digital bank, Boursorama. This is the first strategic pillar. The second one is more about corporate and investment banking, with all the traditional activities of this area. And our third pillar is around mobility services, because ALD and LeasePlan, which has just remained as Avance, is also part of Société Générale group. So yeah, this is a bit about the group, and maybe I can also share about my role within the group. So I am the Chief Digital Strategy Officer for the group, which means that my mandate is to lead all across our business line and all across our geographies the strategic, the digital strategy of the group. So I represent this digital strategy and help the group to reach our targets regarding our digital transformation. And I'll also represent the the group towards our different stakeholders, being investors, regulator, as you were saying, and of course our big clients.
And that's a tough job, right? Because you're such a complex organization, and you as a centralized role have to find ways to make that innovation happen, but also kind of help people build on each other, right? It's a tricky job.
It's an interesting job. it's a very big group, and it's a complex activity, because that's right that we have different kind of businesses, and digital maturity is not the same across the businesses. But what we have in common within the group is that, as you see on this slide, our corporate purpose includes innovation. It's really alongside with responsibility, one of the pillars of our corporate purpose. So this is really a part of our DNA. So of course, our digital transformation journey has started a couple of years ago now, fortunately, and AI is definitely a big part of this digital strategy. We see it actually in Société Générale as really an accelerator of our digital strategy, with potential impact all across our businesses and in all business areas. It can be customer experience and growth, and also it can be operational efficiency and risk management. And AI is really all across this business area. For example, basically half of the expected value coming from our use case portfolio concern customer experience and growth, and the other half concern operational efficiency and risk management.
Well,
So
well,
this is
wonderful.
really...
Let's talk about this a little bit more. Can we back out a step though, and just think about the industry itself, and then jump back in? I kind of jumped the gun on asking you all
Of
on
course.
what you're running, but you have this viewpoint across the industry, and not only across the industry, but across dozens of countries. What are some trends that you're seeing in generative AI?
So maybe first thing I want to share is that generative AI is a very big step more on the AI journey, but it's a step more. That means that it's not a complete shift neither. This is very important, because all banks for years now have very interesting AI and advanced analytic use cases. They have it on analytics and data processing, on machine learning, and data exchange, on different kind of AI. So really, it's important to have in mind, for example, in Société Générale, but in many other banks, real-time payment, fraud management is AI-based, overdraft management is AI-based, commercial recommendation, many of them are AI-based already. So this is very important, because we do not start from nothing, let's say. This said, that's right that generative AI and ChatGPT, in particular, is really a game changer in this journey for different reasons. The first one is really the revolution in terms of usages. Of course, we all know this figure that ChatGPT reached more than 1 million users in a day, I think, so in 5 days, I think, or something like that. So it was really unprecedented. It's a bit like COVID for digital, so it was really a revolution in terms of awareness. This is very important, because that means that any worker within the bank is now understanding the potential. What we see in the market in terms of trends in banking is that basically consulting firms would tell you that we could expect between 3 and 5% productivity uplift thanks to generative AI. The question is not so much, is it the right figure, but when can we expect to reach this kind of productivity uplift? What we see is that basically on the market, there is a matter of technological progress, but there is also a matter of adoption by the businesses. So consensus is that probably this kind of productivity uplift can be reached between 3 and 5 years. So this is an interesting trend that we see. Why this will need some time, even if the technology is ready? This is because of all the use case ideation and prioritization that we have to do. This is because of the risk topic, which are not a simple issue, and we will probably elaborate on that. And this is also, of course, about all the organizational implication and upskilling implications that it has for banks in general. And when I discuss with my fellows in the other banks, we all are working on the same topics to make this great buzzword, a really great reality, because there is a huge potential, but it's a bit of work to mobilize it.
It's interesting what you say there, right? That, the technology potential is there. And of course, every week we hear more features being released. But the organizational part is the hard part. And, it comes back to in this digital world, right? The digital part's actually not the hard part, the transformation is. And, just a simple analogy I think about is that computers, they tend to do what you tell them to. And people are a completely different story, right? People, you have to persuade them and then hope they do it. So that delay is important. So let's jump in then and think a little bit about where are the opportunities. In the digital transformation area, we have studied this now for a long time, and of course, Noémie, you and I have worked on this also as you develop your strategies. That's how we got to know each other first. We have a Sloan Management Review article here that talks about where you can look for opportunity. It's the new elements of digital transformation, and we have 4 major areas where you can look. In customer experience, right? Designing that smooth, emotionally engaging experience for the customer, not just designing a bunch of transactions. In operations, thinking about not only automation, but also how to connect and make the things more dynamic, how to make them smarter and more information informed. Certainly on business models, there is the giant business model idea, but there's an awful lot of opportunity that doesn't mean owning your market, but doing better things with what you have. Information enhancements, digital enhancements to what you're doing. And lately, the last 4 or 5 years has been this idea of employee experience, right? Because employees are, first of all, happy employees tend to make happy customers, but employees are also the best sensor you have into how your processes are moving. And so if you can improve the employee experience, it's very likely you're going to improve the entire set of processes in your company, in your bank, and make it forward. So here are some 4 things that we've seen in the digital transformation area and where to look. One thing to notice in here is the word technology isn't in here anywhere, right? You apply the technology to make these changes. On the other hand, there is that green area at the bottom. We do need to get the technology, the IT right, so you can inform these and you can also link these together as they're going. So having shared this general idea of where to look based on our digital transformation research, where are you finding the opportunities with generative AI inside SocGen? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's do a poll. Where are you as the attendees here, as our participants? Where are you finding opportunities to do generative AI? And this up here we list the 4. We also listed one more because it's just important with every. Certainly we've talked about it here and in other places. There's a lot of experimentation going on, right? Noémie said that people are just using this, and it's true. And so that may be happening a lot. So just click into your finding, your poll here, where all that apply, where are you experimenting with generative AI in your company? Okay, here we go. Okay, look at that, Noémie, where the biggest number is. It's in employees experimenting on their own. That's interesting. And then customer experience and operations. I expected to see customer experience more and employee experience more. The fact that operations is so big is surprising. So what do you think? How do these numbers look to you?
It's very interesting, because when we look at our global AI portfolio, as I was saying, is pretty well spread between the different categories. But when we are talking about generative AI, the answers start to be a bit different, right? So what I see is that generative AI for me is really, really a technology which is performing and getting efficiency. But that does not mean that efficiency does not come by employee experimenting on their own. So it is pretty interesting. What I would say that the way I like to categorize the use cases coming from
we have a slide on this. Let's go back
AI.
to the slides here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry to interrupt you there.
No problem. So yeah, the way I like to because what is true is that if we consider that employee experimenting by themselves, it also goes with the idea that ideation is not the hard part with generative AI, because we had this great user experience provided by ChatGPT, which really was a very a great catalyst for ideation. So, for example, in Société Générale, we had no problem to have more than 100 use cases in a bottom-up approach when we started to ask for ideation, right? But once you've said that, the real difficulties start, right? Because you need to classify and you need to prioritize. So in terms of classification, what I think is interesting is the 4 categories I've shared with you. What we see is that generative AI, the question we have to ask ourselves is, where is it more performing than traditional AI? Because this is a real question. It can do a lot of things, but where is it really better than other kind of AI? What I see is 4 categories. The first one is virtual expert. Basically, this kind of use cases, they leverage on the ability of generative AI to go and find an information in a very complex, heterogeneous, and maybe not very well structured corpus of document. Here you will find many kind of use cases. For example, the ticketing, the automatic ticketing. You will find all which is around agent assistance, legal assistant, for example. You will also find many things about market watch, regulatory watch, this kind of use cases, right? This is the first kind of category. The second one is about content generation. Here, you will leverage not only the ability to do semantic search and to find data in complex corpus of document, but also the summarization capabilities. Here, you can use it to provide content generation for customer. It can be marketing campaigns. It can be RFPs, answers to RFPs. This can be also documentation. I work in a pretty regulated industry, so we have a lot of work to document what we do. So it's very useful for this kind of use cases. So you can imagine that the content generation is a very interesting kind of category of use cases. The third one is client assistance. Here, you will leverage, of course, with the previous capabilities, summarization and data expression, but what will be important and differentiating is the ability of generating AI and large language models to really interact in a personalized way with a personalized tone with the customer. This is really interesting for all the chatbots and call bots with the customers, right? So this is the third category, and the fourth one is about code generation and software optimization. Let's say this is a kind of content generation, but this is specific, and there is a so big impact that we've made it a specific category. So maybe this is a good way also to look at it in a bit different way than the one we used to use, which is customer operations and so on, because in the end, it's an easier clusterization method for the use cases where GenAI is really differentiating.
And it's really interesting because what you're finding is, rather than say, as you said, customer operations, these things actually can go across all of those areas. You might do expert work for customers and for internal work, certainly content generation and documentation throughout in code. So it is interesting. It's kind of like coming at it vertically or horizontally as you think about these opportunities. So that leads just to the next question, which is, okay, so you've got 100 ideas. All of which are previously, you said, qualified cases. So I'm sure there were more that were not qualified for whatever reason. And now you actually have to make them happen. And that's really the hard part, right? For all the reasons you said before. So can you walk us through, how are you making this work? How are you taking those 100 ideas and turning them into real things?
Yeah, of course. So to really, this is the big challenge. So first criteria, which is always very important, and this one has not changed since we work on AI. This is value creation at the core, impact. In Société Générale, we've been, I think we've been the first European bank to start communicating to investors, not on the number of use cases, but on the global value that we were expecting from our use cases portfolio. And we have an official target, which has been communicated to investors, which is 5 million euros of value creation yearly with our portfolio of use case. This was before generative AI, right? But still, it was really at the core of our AI strategy. And this value-driven approach is really at the core also of our prioritization approach for generative AI. This is the first criteria. The second one is feasibility, of course, because again, generative AI offers a lot of new opportunities, but it is not a magic wand neither. So you still have to have correct data if you want to leverage your data. You still have to clean the data, to have the skills and so on. So feasibility remains an important criteria. And we also, with a new technology, you also need to be able to launch in production pretty quickly some flagships. So you will also sometimes need to work on a use case which is a bit less impactful, but maybe that with an impact which will be easier to mobilize in the short term, because it's always also hard to choose between some incremental use cases with maybe a smaller productivity lift, but in the short term, versus a much more transformative use case with a much bigger impact in the end, but maybe on the longer term. So we have to balance this, right? Mm-hmm. And the last criteria, which is pretty new with generative AI, is really reusability, because one of the game-changing aspects of generative AI is that as it's pre-trained, there is much less work to do internally in order to fine-tune the models and so on, and it's done for a very generic use. So that means that the reusability potential of the capabilities that you need to operate a use case is very big. So this is also where my 4 categories become very useful, because if you take one use case in each category, you will not only manage to deliver your flagship and let's say enroll your organization on this new technology, but you will also be able to deliver a kind of blueprint by category, being a technical blueprint, being a risk blueprint, in order to scale up within your local data labs once you've managed to put one flagship in production. So this is really the approach we are having in Société Générale. We want to select a limited number of use cases to put at scale or in production and at scale in the short term, maybe around 5 to 10, not more, to really be able to design these blueprints and to accelerate the local labs in the medium term to deliver new use case. And another criteria which is interesting is also take some use cases where you will fine-tune open source model or market models, and some cases where you will really take the models as they are from vendors. So this is also a criteria that you have to keep in mind when you do your selection if you want to have a good learning curve.
That's really interesting. So you're talking about not only each case standing on its own, but each case, especially early in the game, creating capability that will make later business cases work better. And
absolutely.
So you're in your prioritization, you're thinking long-term and short-term all at the same time, and how to also get extra bang for every euro that you invest in there. That's fascinating. So this actually gives us a chance for another poll. We're about to talk about risk management. So let's ask all of you out there, which risks really matter most to you? So if we can pop the poll up again, which risks are you most concerned about? Is it inaccurate information for decisions? Is it customers being unhappy? Noémie, you had talked about maybe doing customer interactions this way. Do people like doing that? Does it make mistakes? Privacy, regulatory, just the risk of disconnected activity, the risk of just our IT not being able to keep up, or the data is the data available? Which ones of these really matter most to you? Of course, you can choose all of them that apply. It's interesting, on the last thing, one of the people wrote in chat, we had those categories and they'd like to see a Venn diagram of the overlap between those categories. And it's true, that would be interesting to see. I haven't yet figured out how to do a poll that way, but maybe our smart people here at Sloan Management Review can figure that one out. So how is the poll looking? Oh, okay. What do we have here? We have enough that it goes off the bottom of the screen. So inaccurate information is the biggest, that looks like the biggest one so far. There's another one down below, right? Can I slide this? There it is. Yeah, so the biggest one we have is the inaccurate information.
And data, yeah.
Privacy, certainly. And then data is up there. What do you think, Noémie? How does that look to you?
What I noticed, which is interesting, is that customer dissatisfaction is very low. So that means that we are all conscious that the customer is waiting for us to use smartly and responsibly the new technology. So I think it's interesting. What is interesting also is that it's pretty split between the different kind of risk in the end, which there is quite an equilibrium. So what I will maybe add is that that's right, that the list of generative AI risks is a long one. It's probably even longer than this one. And there are also, that's right, ethics, resilience risk, third-party risk, because the reality is the models are pre-trained, so they are provided. Business model risk also, maybe if you do not transform fast enough, so it's also another way to approach risk. So what I will say maybe specifically for banking is that we do not discover AI risk with Gen AI or with AI Act. Even before AI at scale, we had already in the banking sector a very strong supervision requirements and framework regarding data models in general, because it's very important in our credit decisioning and so on. So there is a kind of a risk culture which is already very strong in the banking industry. This said, that's absolutely right that there are some adaptations to be done, even if we have assets. I think the main challenge is not so much to have the right risk assessment and the right risk mitigation policy in front of each risk, but it's really how do you build a holistic risk assessment and a holistic risk governance, measuring the net impact on risk of an AI or generative AI product. I take an example. For example, if you manage to have a good generative AI or AI model for fraud pattern detection, it will probably raise your model risk because it relies on a model. It's very critical. So that's right, that it raises your model risk. But at the same time, it lowers your operational risk because you are maybe better to detect fraud pattern. So you see with this example that it's not easy. Decision-making governance around risk has really to be very holistic, and I think it's an interesting thing to have in mind. And maybe the second interesting thing to have in mind is also that with generative AI, as we were saying, many people will use the capability once it will be available to take many kind of decisions, which means that you also need to have very solid automated guardrails in order to not to be in a unitary acceptance of risk each time each time any people in the bank use the model. So this is also the reason why we will need a bit of time in order to really integrate in our core operational models this technology, because we also have to really rethink a very safety environment in order to be able to use this technology properly.
Gotcha. So then that leads us to the third one, right? And you've already kind of previewed a little bit of this on capability, but how do you think about developing the capability behind the scenes to make this all work?
So the capability on risk management, you mean, or more generally in Gen AI?
More generally, because
broadly,
so we thought about we got to prioritize, and then you need to manage the risk. And
yeah,
the whole point about being holistic, that makes it tough. But then there's also just the capability side, right? There's the data, there's the skills.
Absolutely. So the capability side, basically, maybe again, it's interesting to compare what is different versus traditional AI. So in terms of governance and capability building with traditional AI, and it's the case in many banks, what works well was a federated model because the reality is that you might have very specific models and specific activity. For example, I have in Société Générale a use case on intraday liquidity management, which is a pretty specific one, as you can imagine. But this one, of course, it is built by the local data lab of my finance division, and of course it goes through the risk framework of the group, but it's very specific. As we were saying with Gen AI, it's different because there is a lot of reusability and it's generic purpose. So the way you are going to build your capabilities is that probably you will adopt, and this is what I observe really on the market, everyone is going through a much more global approach in building the technical capabilities, as well as the risk framework and the prioritization framework, to be honest, but that's pretty strong on the capabilities. This is also a choice which is a bit an imperative because, as you may know, on the generative AI, there is a problematic of scarce resources, being compute capacities, but also skills that still have to be built. So what we observe is that it can be called center of excellence or program or factory or anything, but in the end, everyone is moving toward a more global approach. So this is also what we are doing in Société Générale. We are moving towards a more global approach. The idea is the business unit and the service unit really focus on framing the use cases, assessing the impact, the feasibility, the potential reusability, and so on. And the central center of excellence focus on providing the right capabilities, being methodology, being tech capabilities, being blueprints, and so on. So our capability should be available. It's already available in alpha version, but it will be available by the end of the year. And as I was saying before, we will firstly focus it on our precursor use cases.
It's really interesting. You talk about the skills, and the skills are even more important in the Gen AI than the traditional AI. But then, as you said it, I said, well, of course, because Gen AI is something that anybody can use. Traditional AI was kind of magic that only a few people could use, and could build, and then you would use the models they produced. And so, yeah, building the skills, but also I imagine you got to help people understand what they can do, but also what they shouldn't do with these tools. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. And with traditional AI, it was something that you might be using without knowing it, because when you are using your mailbox, you were using AI in the end, or for example, when you were in a branch and that you were managing the overdraft of your customer with some recommendation, you was using AI, but you were not developing AI, and this is the main difference, that with the prompting system and so on. The reality is that you can yourself, by asking the right question, really experimenting on your day-to-day the AI. So this is that's right, the main difference. So I've read a figure which is interesting, which is 68% of the people using generative AI in the professional environment do it without telling their company. So I think, fortunately, this is a cross-industry figure, and I'm pretty confident that the figure should be a bit lower in banks, because, as I was saying, we have a very strong risk culture on data confidentiality and so on, a lot of compulsory regulatory training and so on. But it's an interesting figures anyway, because it shows that people want us to accelerate, right? So
it's interesting you said that. Yeah, the first thing that happened when you said that is I just thought about raising teenagers, and you hope you give them the right values and the right training so that they can, when they're going off and doing this experimenting, they're not getting in too much trouble.
Absolutely, but it's totally the same. The analogy is very good, because the reality is that we won't be able to control everything that everyone is doing, and it's already the case. I mean, people in banking today, they have access to confidential information, and then they have a personal life, so they go to dinners and so on, and they do not talk about the banking account of their customer in the dinner. So it's not so different, it's just to adapt some risk culture that we've already built for 115 years, and trying to adapt it to the new reality of the AI age. And of course, as we are, for example, delivering, this is also the main explanation of the ban of the standard market ChatGPT, and the reason that the financial institution are developing their own version of this kind of tool. This is also to show to the people who are going to use it that there is a right way. You are in the professional context, so there is a right way to use it, as there is a right way to use any of your professional tool, and it goes with good, of course, good practices. And again, I was reading something interesting, which is it was an article saying that one of the main risks coming from Gen AI is rogue modeling. It's not rogue trading anymore, but rogue modeling, so that you have to make sure that people have the right risk culture and know the way they can use AI in order to remain in the firm good interest. So yeah, there is a very big culture part here.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Well, at this point, we're seeing a whole lot of questions going out to the in the participants asking, and so I should stop asking questions and let Abby ask some of the questions that the audience is asking. So Abby, over to you.
Great. So much good information that it's really raising a lot of questions with people who are trying to think about how to apply this within their own organizations. And so one of the questions has to do with how are you determining value? So I'm sorry, I'm going to not pronounce this right. Floricia asked Noémie, what KPIs do you use to measure the effectiveness of using generative AI for team tasks and goals? Or are you even doing that at this point?
It's a very good question. As I was saying, the value assessment is really at the core of the AI strategy. So the asset that we already added at that during the past few years, we've worked really strong on this topic, on AI in general. So what we have in Société Générale is that we have a common portal where business units and service unit register all their AI use cases in a common format with specific questions and so on. So this is the first step. So we have a portal where we can see all the use cases from ideation to production at scale happening all across the group. So it's around 600 use cases basically. Wow. Then on this portal, they have to assess the potential value at scale of their use cases with a framework that we've provided centrally, which is a value assessment framework, taking into account several criteria depending of the use cases. But it can be how many FTEs are currently working on the process you want to automate, if it's an automation use case, and what is the saving that you could expect. It can be a kind of it can be, for example, customer satisfaction upgrade cross the long-term value of the most satisfied customer. This kind of metrics, in order to have a standard way at the group level to assess the value. Because of course, if you do not have a standard way to assess value, you cannot prioritize properly. So this is the way we are working. And so this is really expected value. So we ask really for them to assess the expected value. And then once the use case is in production, so my 500 million euros target at the group level, this is about this expected value, and it's affected by business unit, and they have to reach a certain level of expected value with their AI use cases. And then once the use case is in production, they have also to report about the effective real realize you in order to cross-check, that the estimation was good at the beginning. And if we see discrepancies, it's also for us a good indication in order to review the assessment methodology, saying, okay, maybe we've been too optimistic on this kind of use cases, because track record shows that in the end this is not the way it really happens in reality. So this is what we do, but it's a lot of work also with our local data lab in order to align on the right methodology and to be sure that we manage to really steer the ROI, on these AI use cases. So on generative AI, it's not different. We just capitalize on this one.
Great. It was sort of related to that. There's a question around getting buy-in and getting news happening. And so Jose is asking, how did you influence stakeholders that might be reluctant to use Gen AI or to allow the use within their parts of the organization? And he says that we've seen a digital gap, especially in upper management.
It's a very good question. It's a very fair question. So that's right, that there is a big work. Again, we can build on foundation built over the past 3 years on AI in general. So we had a specific session with our top management. When I say top management, it's really a general management, board of administrator, and COMEX, XCOM, sorry, and also a focus on our top 1,200 managers. So here we have had a specific training program on AI, so really to understand not so much the tech part of it, but really the business model impact of it and the operational model impact of it. So definitely our senior management have granted a lot of time to really understand what does that mean. Then we have this target set at group level and communicated to investors, which is also a good trigger, because we have to make it, so everyone in the business unit have its own part of the target at the head of business unit level. So they had to understand their portfolio and to understand the use cases of their portfolio. Then we do a quarterly monitoring of this target with we have a community of digital and data leaders across the group. It's around 60 to 70 people who are reporting directly to the head of business unit and service unit. So we work with them quarterly. We do a use case portfolio review in order to inform their boss where they are in the target. And then we also offer to more operational team some methodology. So I was talking about the value framework methodology, but there is also ideation framework methodology. There is also we also have centrally, we have a small AI lab who can also help the local lab in framing the use cases in order to be sure that they do not use, let's say, AI just on top of reality, but they really use AI in order to work on their real pain point and real strategic opportunities, because this is also something important when you go from number of use case to value. You also realize that there were in the end a couple of use cases in your portfolio which were more than I tick the box of AI, but with no real relationship with the strategy. So this is also something that we insist on. It's better to have less use cases with bigger value at stake than a broad range of use cases.
Great. Just curious, how many of the decisions around whether to proceed or not, or whether you're seeing the value or not, has to get rolled up to the central organization, or is it happening on the ground in individual business unit?
So here, different answer depending on Gen AI or traditional AI. For traditional AI, the business unit were pretty free in terms of prioritization of their use cases. They were asked to use the group framework for value assessment and feasibility assessment, but then they were master of their decision making prioritization. With generative AI, we are changing that because we do not want to invest several times on the same kind of capabilities because we do not have the resources. It's costly, and in terms of skills, we do not have the resources, and we do not want to take too much risk and to have a spread risk taking. We really want to have a consolidated vision of the risk. So here, people in the data lab, in the local data lab, and in the business unit, they can experiment as much as they want, but for scale, all the decision will be taken globally. And we have also a global executive sounding board who will be with a head of all business units, which will be validating the criteria and the precursor. But experimentation has to remain possible everywhere, of course, because if not, you just stop innovation, and this is not what we want. But for scale, we need to agree collectively.
Great. I know, George, you had a related question to this. I don't know if you want to hop in with some of the things that you were thinking about.
Yeah, one of the questions, and we saw it in the chat too, there are an awful lot of technology vendors out there that must be approaching you every day. And, both the big companies and the small startups. And yet every time I look at the new releases of these tools, they've got more features some startups just disappear that day. So how do you think about the opportunities and the risks in dealing with these innovative vendors and startups that approach you?
That's right. That technological landscape is very dynamic on this topic, and it's also multi aspect because you have of course the hyperscalers who are very important on the landscape. You have the startups, but you have also the smallest, not hyperscaler, but big vendors who are also developing their own generative AI capability within their own tools. So and then you have the open source landscape. So you have a pretty complex landscape. Here, our conviction is that definitely we won't build everything, but no one on the market won't build everything. And this topic, I think it's really obvious. We try in our case to balance between in our precursor use cases. We will try to balance between some really what we call taker use case, where we really take an existing offer from a vendor. So for example, I think which is pretty obvious is, for example, on code generation. GitHub is a very big provider, so we of course are running a pilot with GitHub. So this is a good example. Another example, which is pretty obvious, and I won't specifically elaborate on our position because we do not communicate on it, but everyone is wondering about the Office Copilot. Of course, for here nobody is going to redevelop. This is pretty clear. So this is where we consider to be taker, and then on the rest we will be shaper anyway. So we won't build the model because the interest of the generative AI model is to be pre-trained, but we will fine-tune some models that we've chosen, and here the partnership logic becomes very important because many players, notably on the open source landscape, also are looking for strategic partners, strategic corporate partners, in order to upgrade their own models and so on. So there is a new kind of relationships between vendors and corporates to be invented on this specific topic. So we invest a lot of time also on that, but it's moving.
That vendor landscape is complicated, complex, and then there's also the industry landscape, and so Veronique asks, as you're going through the innovation process and coming up with use cases, are you collaborating with others in your industry or is it a very competitive and closed kind of environment?
Good question. It's a good question. So I think there is a good for me. There is a kind of dialogue on this topic. There are a lot of events, and we all we all know that we will learn also through debate. So I think we discuss a lot. I think also you do not need to share. All your confidential information in order to learn on this topic. So I think there is really room for peer cooperation, and there are some stuff that of course we keep for us as our competitors, but um, so far I think it's really a balance of the two, and then we are all in the process of the learning curve. And there is also some topics, specific topics, where there will definitely be a stronger cooperation. I'm thinking, for example, of responsible AI or risk management more generally. I think on this we will have to discuss with the regulator as an industry on some specific points, and it's the same for responsible AI. We have, for example, cooperation with research also, or the research world. So here you can definitely cooperate. For example, we have worked with there is a research organism in France called Hub AI, working on this topic. And here there are several banks collaborating, for example, for a white paper on AI or Gen AI risk management, and so on. So
Nice.
depends on the topic, I would say.
So, Noémie, you had mentioned this before, and I wonder whether this is also a great opportunity for collaboration across the financial services companies on the skills end, right?
The skill set,
Yeah.
yeah.
So how are you developing these skills for your people? How are you developing your people? Is that an opportunity to collaborate also?
Yes, of course. So that's right, that there is a problematic of skills. What is interesting is that at the very beginning of Gen AI, we've heard a lot that there will be a need for new profiles and so on. What we think now is that it's not so much a need for new profiles, but much more a need for new skills and competencies for existing profiles. That means that data scientists will need to acquire new skills, executives will need to acquire new skills, tech people samely. So I think there is an evolution. I see it on the discussions on the market also. So then there are different strategies to build the skills. You can, of course, you can hire, you can upskill. You can also take resources externally and so on. So for now, what I see on the market is a bit a mix of all of that. We are working internally, and as many banks, of course, on the upskilling part of this program. This will be part of the global orchestrated part of it. So yeah, it's a work in progress, and so far there is a lot. I think the precursor use cases we have selected will also be a very good way to assess, and also beyond the qualitative aspect, to be also on the quantitative aspect. I mean, is it one competency among 10 that you had that you need to add, or is it half of the job? This has to be clarified.
We had a lot of questions around business models, and I think there's sort of a general feeling by some people in the audience that this will have a very large impact on business models. So one question was, when or how do you see current business models of mature organizations being disrupted? And I'll throw that one to both you, George, and Noémie. And then Chris was wondering how much you see AI is driving incremental improvement in various areas versus, again, really requiring fundamental change to strategy and business model.
Do you want to take it, George, and maybe I complete, or as you want?
So, what's happening that I'm seeing out there, at least, is a lot of incremental use right now, because that's the places where you can do the very quick experiments, and it's also where individual users can do their quick experiments. The bigger transformational is, we're hearing stories about it, but haven't yet seen those big things come out yet. Where have we seen? So some banks, for example, that the minute a competitor releases its financial statements, the bank knows, has summarized all that, and they now know the state of those people, that kind of thing. I wouldn't call that transformative, but I'd call that important. The transformative stuff is going to happen later. I think there's a bigger question is, should we expect this to fundamentally transform what's happening? Or should we expect it to make it better? And Noémie, you had said that earlier, right? That this is a big step, but it's not jumping off a cliff. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think for now, and what I see on the market is the same. We've done a benchmark just recently, so I've seen that really 80% of the use cases so far on banks are really working on are not transformative. I mean, it depends on what you call incremental. 20 to 40% productivity uplift is not so incremental, but it's not, let's say, that completely new ways to do things. So I think we need to go through this period in order to manipulate the technology, to take the right decision. Again, we are in a very regulated industry, so we have to be very cautious on the risk part, and we won't take unuseful risk. So we will take the time to do it properly, and I think it can't be theoretical. It has to be practical, so we need to practice a bit in order to be clear on that. And then that's right that there are more transformative questions that can be asked, but it's a bit the same than with digital, because for example, with generative AI, there is a very big question about the deep nature of the relationship with the customer. For example, if you take e-commerce, today there is a certain way to do to buy online, being a financial services or being a consumer goods. Maybe there is something here with generative AI that could absolutely change the way we are buying things online. But so far, it's pretty hard to see what the future will look like. But it's an important question when you start to think about how can I change or transform my chatbots and my call bots with generative AI. Is it how can I do the same but more efficiently and with more quality and so on with Gen AI, or is it how could I build the new kind of customer interaction leveraging generative AI? So that's why everyone is thinking about these complex and very impactful use cases, but we have to be careful not to do it as how I do the same that I'm doing today with a new tech, but really how will it really change the experience, the global experience? It's really the same than with digital, when we started by digitalizing all the complex process, and at some point we say, oh, but maybe there is a much simpler way to do it with digital. So it's a bit the same story.
Very good.
This question, I imagine the answer is going to be sort of, it depends, but the question is, what is a reasonable time to see generative AI-based use cases generate ROI? And you were just talking about some of these use cases as being very complicated. There are others that are probably less complicated and shorter term. So do you have any sense of when you expect to be seeing that return? Obviously not for everything that you're working on, but do you have some sense of when you're hoping to see the return or not, and make decisions about moving forward?
Some use cases can have very quick return because some use cases are prioritized because they allow also to make very short-term savings. For example, when you have something that you are paying in euros outside, it's very easy to say, okay, if I do it with Gen AI and if I manage to do it better, I'm thinking, for example, of marketing campaign. I don't know, for a marketing campaign, you use an agency, so you pay a certain amount. If you manage to do it by yourself and much more efficiently with generative AI, you just do not pay what you were paying before. So this is very rapid return on investment. On other topics, it will be much more longer. So I think it's very hard to answer. I think we will all probably try to balance between small use cases with rapid return and at the same time we all see the huge potential, and we do not want to limitate ourselves to only very, very small use cases. So really, it's very hard to answer. I think it's a balance again. Yeah, the range I was giving at the beginning, saying that maybe between 3 and 5 years you will really start to see the effect. This is what I see on the research. But we'll see.
Great. And no, this time has gone so quickly. George, I know you had one last question you wanted to end with.
Yeah, if I could. It sounds easy, but of course it's hard. If you could say one thing for the people here trying to figure out how to make Gen AI work in their companies, what's the one most important thing they should know?
We've discussed a lot. I think I will cheat. I will take two. I think really a global approach is very important for me. I think you really need to implement a global approach, and it's a challenge because in a big company, a diverse activity across countries and so on, it's a challenge. But I think it's really something that is needed. And I think the second one is people. You really need to enroll all the people, and it goes with the global approach because the simplest you are in your strategy, or let's say the more global you are in the strategy, more understandable you are for people. And there is of course behind the word people also all the skills topic, but we've already discussed it. But I think it's really a matter of people, of culture, of skills, and for this you need to be very clear and you need to be global.
Very well. George, Noémie, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insights and your experience. It's just so exciting to see the kinds of things that are happening, and it's great for you to share that with our audience. And I want to thank the audience as well, very engaged, and thank you for your good questions. And a special thanks to our sponsor, Skillsoft. We really appreciate your support, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, George. Thank you, Abby. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.